Welcome back to part 2 in the story of the notorious Prohibition-era mobster, George Bugs Moran. We pick up where we left off in part 1 at the end of 1926, with the Northsiders facing a critical ultimatum. Jaime Weiss, the most feared member of the Northsiders, has just been brutally gunned down outside their headquarters at Schofield's Flower Shop, the same site where their original leader, Deanie O'Banion, had been murdered by Southside assassins 2 years earlier. With Al Capone and his Southside crew on an all-out rampage, the remaining Northside leaders, Bugs Moran and Vinnie Drucci, found themselves at a crossroads. Should they continue retaliating with their Tommy guns blazing, or should they regroup, strategize and come up with a more calculated plan? The weight of that decision rested squarely on the shoulders of George Bugs Moran. Moran's relationship with Capone was a bitter one, the two having been in a constant tit-for-tat gang war for over 2 years since the death of O'Banion, and both sides reeling losses in their ranks, with a relentless river of blood flowing through the Windy City and bodies turning up machine-gunned beside the garbage in some Chicago alley on a near daily basis, a fate Bugs particularly sought to avoid. This escalating violence culminated in what would become the most infamous gangland massacre of the century, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a brutal event that shocked not only America, but the whole world. After Jaime Weiss's untimely death, Bugs Moran assumed leadership of the Northside gang. Respected and admired by his men, Moran swore to topple Al Capone, the untouchable behemoth of Chicago's underworld. Fueled by a burning desire for revenge, Moran was determined to stop at nothing until his arch nemesis was brought down. Starting in December 1926, the Northside gang began transitioning into legitimate businesses, albeit through illegitimate means. By seizing control of industries like the Dry Cleaners Union, they were positioning themselves for the eventual end of Prohibition, anticipating that their bootlegging profits would soon dry up. Though Prohibition was still in full swing at this point, influential politicians in Washington, including Franklin D. Roosevelt, then just a popular senator from New York, had started to acknowledge that the Volstead Act, Prohibition's official title, was a failure. Maxey Eisen, a witty yet effective labour enforcer, helped Moran make inroads with the unions. Eisen took a brief break from the seedy business to tour Europe with his wife, but upon returning shortly after the death of Jaime Weiss, he was appalled at how matters had degenerated between the Chicago gangs. Saddened by Weiss's demise and concerned that his friends Moran or Drucci could be next, Eisen persuaded them to face reality, whether they liked it or not. It was time to strike a peace deal with Al Capone. A good friend of Moran's, Maxey Eisen convinced Bugs to offer an olive branch to Capone and acted as the mediator between the two factions. Capone agreed. What followed was a summit not only between Capone and the Northside gang, but also with all of Chicago's crime bosses. Maxey Eisen and Tony Lombardo, who now led the Unione Siciliana in Chicago after Mike Merlo's death, served as the arbitrators. The date was the 15th of January 1927, and the venue was the Hotel Sherman, the same room where Jaime Weiss and Al Capone failed to agree peace just 5 months earlier. In attendance was Bugs and Vinnie from the Northsiders, Al Capone, Frankie Rio and Frank Nitti from the Southsiders, Spike O'Donnell from the far west side, Diamond Joe Esposito, who had since taken control of the Loop after half of the Jenner brothers were murdered by the Northsiders and the other half fled Chicago, Terry Druggan and Frankie Lake, who held the near west side, and the much-feared Frank McCurlane, who now governed the Stockyards area. By the end of the peace meeting, a peace agreement was reached, which, on paper, appeared promising. It outlined that rival gangs would no longer encroach on each other's territories, the city's lucrative booze trade would be shared, and members from every single faction would stop the name-calling and public provocations. For the first time in years, peace seemed to reign. The next major death in the underworld, that of the second in command of the Northsiders, Vinnie Drucci, wasn't due to gang warfare, but a confrontation with a Chicago policeman. On April the 4th, 1927, Drucci was involved in the newly united syndicate's efforts to re-elect their old ally, corrupt Republican, Big Bill Thompson, in the upcoming mayoral election. With the primaries approaching, Moran and Drucci had agreed to disrupt the Democrats' Northside efforts by kidnapping 42nd Ward Alderman Dorsey R. Crowe, a staunch supporter of the incumbent Democratic mayor, William Deaver. When Drucci stormed into Crowe's office that morning, he was enraged to find the alderman absent. In a fit of anger, he attacked Crowe's secretary and trashed the office. The commotion drew attention, and as Drucci left the building, he was promptly arrested by 2 policemen. Handcuffed and thrown into the backseat of a squad car, Drucci cursed his bad luck and berated the officers, telling them in colourful language exactly where they could go. Officer Dan Healy, seated in the front, warned Drucci to be quiet. That only provoked Drucci further, and he struck Healy, attempting to grab his gun. Healy, reacting swiftly, shot Drucci in the chest, fatally wounding him. At Drucci's grand funeral, his blonde flapper wife Cecilia tearfully told reporters he was a wonderful husband, but a cop killed him for nothing. As George Moran stood over his friend's coffin, he shared her grief, but another weight hung over him. He was now the sole leader of the Northside gang, and Capone, ever ambitious, was still out there, larger than life. Despite the peace treaty, Capone had hinted at his desire for the lucrative Gold Coast, where the upper echelons of Chicagoans lived, and currently the Northsiders' biggest earner. Chicago's elite and business class refused to buy their liquor from Al Capone, a reality that sparked Capone's jealousy of Bugs Moran, who had earned their trust. Deputy Detective Chief John Steege noted at the time that the North Shore millionaires, businessmen and country clubs buy their booze from Moran. On the South Shore, they deal with Ralph Sheldon, another bootlegger. These people do not trust Capone. They are afraid that if they open the door to him, the mafia will come after them with blackmail and shakedowns. Sensing a looming confrontation, Bugs strengthened his organisation and prepared for a potential fight. With the deaths of Jaime Weiss and Vinnie Drucci, his manpower and possibly his confidence were running thin. Many of his old associates, like Louis Two Gun Altery, Nails Morton and Dapper Dan McCarthy, were either dead or had fled Chicago after Jaime's death, which had really shook the city. To bolster his forces, Moran formed an alliance with Terry Drugan, an Irishman from the South Side who had recently fell out with Capone and whose gang Moran could rely on for additional muscle. He also promoted Ted Newberry as his right-hand man. A small brigade of fresh gunmen was also added to his crew, including Jack Zuter and Barney Birch, whilst Willie Marks spearheaded the gang's union activities. Alongside these new recruits, Moran maintained his veteran crew who had been with the Northside gang since the days of Deanie O'Banion, including the feared Gusenberg brothers, accountant Adam Heyer, speakeasy operator Albert Weinshank, bodyguard James Clark and liquor driver John May, who also served as the gang's mechanic. In 1928, Bugs made another strategic move by relocating the gang's headquarters from above Schofield's flower shop. The shop had gained too much negative attention following the murders of O'Banion and Weiss, and the proprietor, William Schofield, was growing increasingly vocal about the bad press. Moran agreed that it was time for a change, noting that the spot had become too well known amongst their enemies. He moved the operation to a more discreet office at 127 North Dearborn in the heart of the Loop, a far cry from the flower shop nestled in a residential neighbourhood. Most of the Northside gang's business was conducted out of sight at the old SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street in the Kilgubbin district. Although the freight handlers had vacated the building years earlier, Moran kept the company's name on the front window as it provided a perfect cover for his unmarked beer trucks to come and go at all hours. The garage wasn't just a depot for illegal goods, it also served as a workshop where Johnny May, the gang's mechanic, could repair their vehicles while the crew hung out and passed the time. When Moran rented the garage from its owner, he was careful to play it safe. He had Adam Heyer, who wasn't publicly linked to any criminal activities, sign the 2-year lease to avoid drawing suspicion. With the crafty Mayor Big Bill Thompson back in office, both Moran and Capone kept a close watch on each other, waiting for the next move. There were minor incidents, though bloodless. For instance, Moran's dog track in southern Illinois burned down, and Capone was suspected of orchestrating the arson. Not long after, Capone's Hawthorne racetrack suffered a similar fate. Capone's reluctance to launch a direct attack on Moran was strategic. With Bugs now firmly in charge of the Northsiders, Capone knew that any renewed conflict would escalate quickly and likely turn bloodier than ever, giving Bugs his reputation. It was hard to find a major gangland shootout in the 1920s in which Moran wasn't a key player, and Capone was well aware of this. Beneath his tough guy exterior, Bugs was an enigma, however. He was undeniably a hard man, yet he had a knack for breaking into a hearty laugh. When it came to them damn Sicilians, he had no qualms about letting his Tommy gun spray, but on the other hand, he attended mass regularly at the Holy Name Cathedral and considered himself a practicing Catholic. Like his fellow Northsiders, he kept a rosary in his pocket, hoping it would bring luck to his hits. He still despised prostitution and derisively referred to Capone as a pimp. To the public eye, Moran was a dapper dresser. On the job, he favoured blue or brown pinstripe suits, topped with a milk-coloured or brown fedora. When out on the town with the Kilgubbin lads, or escorting a socialite's daughter to the Civic Opera House, he donned a tailcoat. However, in the privacy of his apartment, he preferred comfortable yard clothes and a pair of floppy slippers. At 34 years old in 1927, the year he took full control of the Northside mob, Moran began to show signs of settling down. A lover of brunettes, he married one that same year, a showgirl full of Sioux heritage who went by the name Alice Roberts. He cherished his time with her. One day, as he left police headquarters, the dapper Bugs Moran gestured towards a stunning brunette sitting in his car. He turned to a group of reporters and declared that she was his wife, adding that if anyone came looking for him that day, he could tell them it was their wedding anniversary and that they were going roller skating. The sight of Bugs, two guns bulging beneath his tailored jacket, gliding around a rink on roller skates, was unforgettable for many present. Initially, the couple lived in an upscale apartment on Belden Avenue before relocating to the more secure Parkway Hotel on Lincoln Avenue, conveniently close to the SMC Cartage garage, which was located at 2122 North Clark Street. They appeared to be a happy couple, and by all accounts, Bugs was notably faithful. Aside from the presence of a bodyguard with a shoulder holster lingering in the hallway, the Morans could have easily been mistaken for any other affluent couple. Criminal Courts Judge John H. Lyle, who presided over many of Moran's hearings, remembered him as a complex figure who had a sense of humour. One morning in court, after Bugs had repeatedly requested a change of venue, Lyle jokingly asked him if Moran disliked him. Moran replied that he did like the judge, but he was suspicious of him. On another occasion, Lyle ran into Moran at Wrigley Field whilst watching a Chicago Cubs game. When he noticed the judge, Bugs politely removed his hat and shook his hand. Complimenting Lyle on his beautiful diamond ring, he quipped that if it was stolen, the judge shouldn't come looking for him, insisting that he was innocent. On the other hand, Bugs could also be incredibly tough. One time he appeared in court on a minor charge and was mistakenly identified as a runaway felon. Lyle recalled hearing a commotion in the holding area and found Moran, livid with fury, battling 3 bailiffs. With one handcuff on his wrist and the other free, he was trying to use it as a makeshift weapon. He stopped when he saw the judge, apologising for the chaos and explaining that the bailiffs were trying to throw him back into custody. Despite his rough demeanour, Moran was fundamentally a businessman. Whilst he may have lacked direction in his younger days, he learned valuable lessons from his old mentor Deanie O'Banion and even from observing former Southside boss Johnny Torrio. He understood that the best way to avoid trouble was to prevent it from arising. Sensing that trouble was on the horizon, he recognised Capone's ambitions. Capone wanted complete control of Chicago, and Moran was standing in his way. Although Moran had a few loyal gunmen, he knew he needed more firepower. That's why, unexpectedly, he decided to help one of his oldest adversaries, the Italian mafia, eliminate one of its own allies, Alphonse Scarface Capone. Scarface understood that to maintain his power in Chicago, he needed the backing of the local mafia. Whenever he aimed to take down high-profile targets, he sought the approval of the Chicago chapter of the Unione Siciliana, just as Johnny Torrio had when it was Mike Merlo in charge, up until his death in 1924. It wasn't just a matter of respect asking permission from the Unione Siciliana. It was essential for soliciting their advice and ensuring that he had their blessing for his plans. The Unione Siciliana, which would evolve to the Mafia, had previously greenlighted significant hits, including those on O'Banion and Jaime Weiss. However, because Capone was Neapolitan and not Sicilian, he could not officially rise to a high-ranking position within the organisation. This limitation made it imperative for him to have a local don who would support his ambitions. Without that crucial backing, Capone's influence would significantly diminish. Since his arrival in Chicago, Capone had skillfully manoeuvred to install allies in key positions of power within the mafia. He managed to cultivate relationships with figures such as Mike Merlo, Angelo Jenna, Salvatore Amatuna, and eventually Tony Lombardo. Each of these men served as a vital link in ensuring that Capone's interests were protected and promoted within the local underworld. However, the balance of power shifted dramatically when the head of the Unione Siciliana in New York decided to replace Tony Lombardo with a man who was not inclined to support Capone's reign. This abrupt change ignited a series of violent confrontations, plunging the city back into chaos. This power struggle not only affected Capone, but also ensnared Bugs Moran, setting the stage for one of the most notorious gangland killings in history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The rivalry between Capone and Moran intensified as both sought to assert their dominance over the Chicago underworld. Since 1925, Frankie Yale, the capo of the Unione Siciliana in Brooklyn, had harboured a deep resentment towards Capone. The two men shared a history that dated back to their childhood in the Five Points district of New York, where they had both grown up and participated in the violent mob wars that characterised their youth. Even after Capone relocated to Chicago in 1920, the two remained in contact, often exchanging favours and loaning their own gunmen for out-of-town hits. Yale was known for his ruthless efficiency, and he played a significant role in orchestrating the hit on Deanie O'Banion in 1924, with his own gunmen not being recognised by O'Banion. However, the duo had since fallen out. The growing tensions among these powerful figures, fueled by betrayal and ambition, created a volatile environment in which alliances were tested and blood was bound to spill. The impending conflict would not only change the landscape of organised crime in Chicago, but it would also mark a turning point in the deadly game of power and revenge that defined the Prohibition era. After Johnny Torrio left Chicago and handed full control of the outfit to Al Capone, Frankie Yale observed Capone's growing arrogance with disapproval. He attributed Capone's overconfidence to Tony Lombardo, the city's leading union representative, who could provide Capone with excessive freedom and financial support. Funds that should have been paid as a tribute to the Unione Siciliana, specifically to Yale himself. In response, Yale devised a plan to eliminate Lombardo and replaced him with a compliant figure from Milwaukee, Giuseppe "Joey" Aiello. Following discussions with Yale, Aiello travelled to Chicago to ingratiate himself with Tony Lombardo thanks to his connection with Frankie. However, once in Chicago, Aiello escalated the scheme by conspiring to kill Capone as well. Together with his three brothers, Domenico, Antonio and Andrew, Aiello brainstormed ways to take out Capone. Their most audacious plan was involved in bribing the chef at Capone's favourite restaurant, the 226 Club on South Wabash Avenue, with $10,000 to poison Al Capone's food using prussic acid. When the chef alerted Capone to the plot, he reportedly told him, "Geez, if I knew what I was coming into in Chicago, I never would have left Brooklyn." When their initial plans failed, the Aiello brothers foolishly announced a bounty of $50,000 on Capone's head, encouraging anyone willing to kill him. Starting in May 1927, at least 4 hitmen attempted to claim the bounty, but Capone's extensive intelligence network, which included waiters, bookies, street hustlers, cab drivers, newsboys, and even many policemen, proved effective. The would-be assassins barely set foot in the city before they were found machine-gunned to death. In November 1927, Aiello became a suspect in an unrelated murder plot and was arrested. By this time, Capone had caught wind of Aiello's attempts on his life and dispatched little Louis Campagna to send a clear message whilst Aiello was in jail. "If we see your face for one more hour on the streets of Chicago, we're going to introduce it to your ass." Once released, Aiello wasted no time in fleeing to New York. Back in Brooklyn, Aiello reconnected with Yale, who was hiding out. As Capone's whiskey shipments from Canada began to be hijacked in Brooklyn, he learned from a spy named Felice D'Amato that Frankie Yale was orchestrating the hijackings in retaliation for what he perceived as losses due to Tony Lombardo's position. On the afternoon of Sunday the 1st of July 1928, Yale was at the Sunrise Club, one he owned, located at 14th Avenue and 65th Street in New York, where he received a cryptic phone call. The caller claimed something was wrong with his newly wedded wife Lucy, who was home caring for their 1-year-old daughter. Yale rushed to his brand new coffee-coloured Lincoln coupe and sped off along New Utrecht Avenue, headed for home. As he drove, a Buick sedan with 4 armed men pulled alongside him. Although Yale's Lincoln was equipped with armour plating, the windows were not bulletproof. Sensing the danger, Yale accelerated when the traffic light changed, initiating a high-speed chase. As he turned onto 44th Street, the Buick stayed close behind. The gangsters soon overtook him and, from close range, opened fire. A shotgun blast struck Yale in the head, whilst a submachine gun bullet tore through his brain, either wound proving fatal. The now helpless Lincoln veered off course, jumped the curb, and crashed into the stoop of a brownstone at 923 44th Street. This marked the first time that a submachine gun had been used in a gangland assassination in New York City. It was during this tumultuous time that Aiello reached out to Bugs Moran in Chicago. He proposed that with Moran and his men's help, they could eliminate Tony Lombardo, thereby not only removing a strong ally of Capone, but also diminishing Scarface's grip on power. The offer was enticing and Moran found it hard to refuse. On September the 7th, 1928, Tony Lombardo was shot dead at a busy intersection in the Loop. The gunmen were Bugs Moran and Frank Gusenberg. Lombardo had just finished some routine business at the Unione headquarters and was leaving around 4:30 p.m, flanked by bodyguards Joseph Ferraro and Joseph Lolordo. As Lombardo approached the corner of Madison, he turned left and crossed the street, unaware of the two men lurking in the doorway of a nearby restaurant, the Raklios. The assailants opened fire with dum-dum bullets that expand on impact, which struck Ferraro first, leaving him mortally wounded. Two more bullets hit Lombardo in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Lolordo was unharmed, chased the gunmen, but they managed to escape. Capone was furious. He suspected Aiello was behind the hit on his friend Tony, but Aiello was out of town. Big Al contemplated a full-scale assault on the Northside, yet he decided to wait and see who would step up to fill Lombardo's position. Aiello's slow movements allowed Pasqualino Pazzi Lolordo, brother of Lombardo's bodyguard, to gain the upper hand, and was appointed head of the Unione Siciliane. Pazzi, characterised by a calm demeanour and thoughtful approach, advised Capone against rushing into war. A war would not be good for any of us right now, he cautioned Scarface. Nevertheless, Aiello continued to tempt Moran. He pressed Bugs to assist him into getting rid of Lolordo, believing that without him he could secure a favourable vote within the Unione Siciliane. The circumstances surrounding how Moran's men managed to meet with Lolordo at his apartment remain unclear. Lolordo would have likely refused entry to anyone associated with Moran, especially after Capone's warning. It's probable that a trusted associate of Aiello facilitated the meeting, introducing two of Moran's hitmen under false pretenses. On January the 8th, 1929, they arrived at Lolordo's luxurious third-floor apartment on West North Avenue. Lolordo's wife, Alina, later reported that her husband and the three visitors conversed for nearly an hour. She could hear laughter and clinking glasses whilst she ironed. As the trio prepared to leave, gunshots rang out, followed by silence. Rushing into the parlour, Alina saw the strangers leaving, one of them stopping to place a pillow under Patsy's head. After suffering 11 shots from a .38 caliber gun, her husband lay lifeless. A .38 revolver rested just 6 feet away, his fingers still wrapped around a wine glass, while another gun was found on the staircase. Witness accounts indicated that two of the killers were Pete Gusenberg and James Clark, Moran's bodyguard. Although Alina Lolordo couldn't positively identify them, she might have recognised the men, fully aware of the unspoken rule of silence that accompanied the code of a murder. This time, Capone's reaction was not one of fury. Instead, he mourned. Patsy Lolordo, known for his gentle nature, had been brutally murdered, casually conversing with strangers in his final moments. Even though Moran couldn't be directly implicated, Capone was certain of his involvement. This incident pushed Capone over the edge. In a bid for revenge, Capone ordered his men to hunt down Joey Aiello, who had not yet taken over from Lolordo, and Capone trusted his main hitman, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, to specifically target Bugs Moran. Capone promised McGurn a reward of $10,000 for Moran's death, telling him that "you'll pocket 10 grand, kid, if Moran winds up in the obituary lists in the Tribune." And with that lucrative offer, Machine Gun Jack began to hatch a plan. On the frigid morning of February the 14th, 1929, a relentless snowfall enveloped Chicago, transforming the city into a winter wonderland that was anything but festive. The air was bitterly cold, with temperatures plunging to zero. Gusty winds swept through the streets, whipping up tiny, icy projectiles that made even the briefest walk feel like an arduous trek. Vehicles were gridlocked in many areas, and the morning rush hour came to a standstill, leaving commuters frustrated and anxious. Streetcars lurched along slick, treacherous tracks, creaking under the strain of the weather as they navigated the icy roads. By mid-morning, the sky remained a dismal grey, mirroring the gloom of the day, with further snow predicted to add to the already significant accumulation. It was a stark contrast to what should have been a cheerful St. Valentine's Day. As the morning progressed, men began to arrive at the SMC Cartage Company garage, a modest single-storey greystone building nestled at 2122 North Clark Street. The first of the Northsiders to appear was Johnny May, the garage mechanic, who unlocked the doors shortly after 8:30 a.m. He was eager to get started on a flatbed truck that required a new oil pan. Alongside him was his loyal Alsatian dog, Highball, who was tied to the truck's gate, observing his master's movements with a curious eye. Highball's presence added a sense of warmth to the otherwise stark setting. About an hour later, the Gusenberg brothers, Pete and Frank, arrived at the garage. They greeted May with a casual "morning" and took a moment to engage with Highball, scratching the dog behind the ears. As Pete felt a cold draft creeping through the large double doors from the alley, he attempted to block it with an oil rag, muttering about the discomfort. Frank, ever the pragmatist, dismissed the concern, urging his brother to help him get the coffee brewing instead. The steady arrival of other Northsiders continued over the next half hour. James Clark, known for his loyalty to Moran, walked in, followed closely by Adam Heyer, a trusted associate, and Albert Weinshank, who had ties to the gang but maintained a lower profile. Each man contributed to the camaraderie that filled the garage. Amongst them was Reinhard Schwimmer, an eyeglass fitter who fancied himself an optometrist. Whilst he wasn't a gangster, Schwimmer enjoyed the thrill of associating with these men, recalling his connections from the days of O'Banion, which had earned him a sense of belonging in this dangerous world. By the time the clock struck 10:30 a.m, 7 men were gathered in the garage, seeking refuge from the cold. They clustered around a small iron space heater in the corner, exchanging stories and laughter, the warmth of camaraderie evident as they sipped cups of Chase and Sanborn coffee that simmered on a hot plate. The rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of motor oil and machinery. They awaited their boss, Bugs Moran, who had contacted them the previous night with a request for their presence. He wanted them to help unload a delivery of old log cabin whiskey scheduled for around 11 o'clock the next morning, and he had some gang-related business to discuss before the weekend unfolded. As they chatted and warmed themselves, the mood in the garage was a blend of anticipation and unease, unaware that this seemingly ordinary gathering would soon spiral into a day marked by tragedy and violence. 3 of the men waiting in the garage were in their 40s, Clark, Heyer and Weinshank. Frank Gusenberg was 41, whilst his younger brother Pete was 36. John May, looking worn from life's demands, was 35 and had the added responsibility of supporting 7 children at home. The youngest among them was Reinhard Schwimmer at 29. With the exception of Schwimmer, all of them had faced legal troubles at some point. Some had even served time. However, since joining Moran's crew, life had become relatively easier for them. The hours could be grueling, but their boss was generous, often expressing gratitude and paying them handsomely. The toughest of the group were undoubtedly the Gusenbergs, who held a deep-seated animosity toward anything Italian, particularly when it came to Alphonse Capone. They took pride in having opened fire on Capone's top enforcer, Machine Gun Jack, with their Thompson submachine guns. Although they had missed their target, they wore that failure as a badge of honour. In contrast, John May was the most mild-mannered of Moran's regulars. He had made a promise to his wife to stay out of trouble and believed there was no harm in occasionally making some extra cash, whether by helping Moran transport a truckload of alcohol or fixing a cracked cylinder. All the men present at the garage were married and had assured their wives that they would return later in the day. Frank Gusenberg, however, was secretly married to 2 women and felt no real desire to see either one. Capone's plan for the St. Valentine's Day massacre was simple yet ruthless, orchestrated by his associate Machine Gun Jack. To avoid suspicion, Capone distanced himself from the scene by escaping to his winter retreat in West Palm Beach, Florida. Knowing he would be blamed, he scheduled an alibi meeting with a county commissioner at the time of the attack. The plan also involved using a rented garage at 1722 Northwood Street as a staging ground and a place to keep the Southsiders' vehicles. Machine Gun Jack had also placed a spy in a rented apartment facing the garage equipped with binoculars. The spy's job was to monitor the location and alert McGurn's team of assassins when Bugs Moran arrived. However, in a critical mistake, the spy misidentified Albert Weinshank, who resembled Moran in height and clothing, and gave the signal too early. Once the signal was given, Machine Gun Jack's team of 4 hitmen, disguised as police officers, emerged from the garage. Dressed in long trench coats and fedoras, they carried sawed-off shotguns and Thompson submachine guns. A black Cadillac, modified to resemble a police car, pulled up outside the SMC Cartage Company a few minutes after 10:30 a.m. Bugs Moran and Ted Newberry were just a block north of the garage when they caught sight of Willie Marks stepping off the downtown streetcar on Clark Avenue. Marks looked around, adjusting his collar against the chilly air, and the 2 men quickened their pace to meet him. As they approached, Newberry's gaze fell on a police squad parked right outside the building. "Damn it, would you look at that," he muttered, nodding towards the officers as they gathered to the curb. The trio halted, watching with unease as 5 cops casually strolled through the front door. "What a time to show up," Newberry said. Moran's brow raised as he took in the scene. "Let's hope the booze isn't out back," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension. He turned on his heel and led them towards a nearby coffee shop, the door handle just within reach. "Let's grab a cup of coffee until this blows over," he told them. They slipped inside the cosy cafe, the warm air wrapping around them like a blanket. Once seated at a small table tucked away from the waitress's earshot, Moran leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Willie, if they get arrested, make sure our lawyers get my guys out this afternoon, all right?" Marks grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Don't worry about it. They'll be out and all charges dropped. They'll be home in time for dinner." He glanced over his shoulder towards the window, ensuring no one was paying attention, then added, "But we better keep an eye on things, just in case." Moran nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. The coffee shop felt like a safe haven, but the unease lingered in the air. "If those cops find anything, it could turn into a mess real quick," he said, taking a sip of his coffee and scanning the street through the window. Newberry, ever the optimist, added, "Let's just keep it low-key for now. We can't afford any more heat." The 3 men exchanged glances, understanding the stakes that lay ahead as they waited for the tension to ease. The 7 men gathered in the garage perked up at the sound of the bell jingling above the shop door, expecting it to be Moran arriving. Their anticipation turned to shock when, instead, 4 police officers strode in from the foyer. "Hands up and face the wall," barked one of the plainclothesmen. When the men didn't respond quickly enough, he shouted, "Move." The officers spread out, positioning themselves behind the 7 grumbling men who reluctantly pressed their arms against the rough wall, shoulders brushing against each other as they stared blankly at the brick surface, waiting to be searched. "Lay one hand on us, and there will be hell to pay in City Hall this afternoon, coppers," Frank Gusenberg threatened, his voice steady despite the tension. He glanced over his shoulder, surprised when none of the officers responded. Silence enveloped the room. punctuated only by minor rustling and the soft scrape of someone's shoe on the oily cement floor. The quiet felt heavy, almost foreboding. Then, suddenly, a deafening boom shattered the stillness, followed by a rapid series of explosions echoing behind them. Instincts kicked in, but their bodies were paralysed by a wave of violence. Pain erupted as they felt their flesh tearing, the reality of their situation dawning on them too late. They had no time to react before the sensation faded, replaced by the horrifying sight of their own blood splattering against the wall in front of them. If any of them had survived even a few seconds longer after the chaos ceased, they would have heard Highball, the loyal dog, whimpering for its master, a mournful sound that contrasted sharply with the brutality that had just unfolded. Two prime suspects of playing the part of the fake police officers and massacring the men in front of them were John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, both tied to numerous Capone-related crimes in the 1920s, and both being the two men who flanked Frankie Yale at Schofield's flower shop and murdered Dino Banyan. Also involved was Fred Burke, a member of Egan's Rats, little Louis Campagna, who had threatened Joey Aiello at the police cell a few months prior, Claude Screwy Maddox of the Circus Gang, and Joseph Lolordo, brother of the murdered Patsy. Moran peered through the steaming window of the coffee shop and noticed that Clark Street had just become unexpectedly congested. Vehicles were backed up, and despite the biting cold, passers-by paused to stare, their curiosity piqued. A sense of dread washed over him. "Something's not right," he declared. "I'd better dime to a donut they're arresting the guys." Leaving a tip on the table, he pushed through the door, his associates following close behind. The Cadillac that had been parked at the curb was gone, replaced by a small convoy of squad cars. Two uniformed officers stood guard at the entrance, while others rushed back and forth between the garage and the sidewalk, conversing with plainclothes detectives outside. One officer was busy jotting down notes on paper, his expression serious. "Hey kid," Moran called to a young boy rushing past. "What's with all the police?" The boy skidded to a halt, breathless. "Some cops just had a gunfight with some hoods in that building." Moran's crew was wary of police talk. "You sure?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. "You bet, mister. A whole bunch of guys dead inside. It's Bugs Moran and his gang." Moran felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't bring himself to believe it until he saw the morgue attendants arrive, dragging out bodies, one by one. Ted Newbury noticed the shifts in Moran's demeanour and nudged him gently. "You okay, George?" he asked, but all Moran could manage, almost a whisper, was Capone. It's Capone. His mind raced with the implications of that name, dread settling in as the reality of the situation sank in. The gunmen in the garage had created history written in blood. Armed with 4.5 caliber bullets, they etched the final chapter of a notorious band of outlaws into the annals of crime. The Northsiders were done. Each member of that crew, figures like Dino Banyan, Nails Morton, Two Gun Altery, Vinnie Drucci, and Jaime Weiss, left a lasting mark on the violent landscape of their time, their legacies intertwined with the ruthless world of organised crime. The 7 massacred today in the garage were 2/3 of the gang's ranks, a gang which had experienced their ranks depleting with every single hit from the Southsiders. Yet, as the dust settled on that fateful day, Bugs Moran remained, isolated and stripped of his power, a mobster without a mob, in a city that once celebrated his exploits. Capone, having orchestrated the massacre, had emerged the victor, yet he found little satisfaction in his $10,000 investment. In a twist of fate, Moran had managed to arrive late to what was meant to be his own execution, thus denying Capone the complete triumph he sought. In the chaotic aftermath of the shooting, reporters flocked to the Moran apartment, eager for answers. They found a tight-lipped Moran who staunchly denied any connection to the men killed in the garage. His demeanour was one of defiance mixed with an underlying tension. When pressed for his thoughts on who was responsible for the brutal attack, he momentarily regained the swagger that had once defined him. With a steely glare, he proclaimed for the second time in his life to newspaper reporters that only Capone kills like that, a statement that echoed with the weight of both accusation and recognition of the ruthless nature of his rival. In that moment, the remnants of Moran's power flickered, revealing a man still unwilling to concede defeat, even in the face of overwhelming loss. Following the massacre, Moran was hospitalized, grappling with exhaustion and shock. His weakened condition may have stemmed from a severe cold he had had during the incident, compounded by the immediate trauma of the brutal killings at 2122 North Clark Street. The Moran gang, much like the former O'Banion mob, was known for its loyalty and close-knit relationships, but there was one notable exception. Ted Newbury, a Northside gangster, had secretly aligned himself with Capone's crew in return for providing the Capone organization with valuable information about Moran's operations, possibly giving the behemoth the coordinates of the SMC garage. Newbury was promised control over the lucrative Northside. Moran's hold on the territory weakened in the years that followed, and Newbury took advantage of the situation, absorbing more of Moran's Northside territory and funneling the profits to Capone and the Southside. In a bid to regain his power, Moran sought alliances with Joey Aiello and Jack Zuta. Although he had a personal disdain for Zuta after siding with Newbury, he recognised the necessity of gathering all available support against Capone's forces. Many believed Moran's criminal career ended with the massacre, but this was a misconception. He began to envision expansion into California, dispatching some of his henchmen to establish a presence in Los Angeles. However, Bugs Moran's influence was shattered and his luck took a downturn. In the years that followed, until Prohibition was repealed in 1932, he and what remained of his crew made intermittent efforts to reclaim control of the Northside, but Al Capone had firmly established his dominance and was not easily displaced. By the mid-1930s, staring defeat in the face, Moran decided to leave Chicago, first relocating to Wisconsin and then to Minnesota. It was around this time his marriage seemed to disintegrate, as there are no records of his wife Alice accompanying him. Reduced to near poverty but still accustomed to a life of luxury, Bugs Moran made his way back to Illinois. In this unfamiliar world of diminished power, he teamed up with a handful of rural criminals, resorting to robbing banks and petrol stations throughout the latter part of the 1930s. These petty crimes were a far cry from the grand heists he'd once orchestrated as a leading figure in organised crime. By around 1940, Moran sought new opportunities in Ohio, joining the Virgil Summers Albert Fouts gang. This new crew was composed of petty thieves, and they lacked the boldness and notoriety of the earlier bandits like John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, whose exploits they attempted to emulate. Their biggest score was a $10,000 robbery of a tavern in Dayton, an amount of money that Bugs would have seen as chump change back in the Chicago days when he was driven around in a big black limousine wearing his pearl grey suits. However, their efforts caught the attention of law enforcement, and by 1946, the Federal Bureau of Investigation finally apprehended Moran. After his arrest, Moran drifted from state to state, engaging in various criminal activities including robberies, counterfeiting money and forging American Express checks. Despite his attempts to evade the law, it eventually caught up with him, leading to multiple prison sentences. Just as he was on the verge of release, he was sent back to prison due to the resurfacing of an earlier charge. Deep down, Moran sensed that his days of freedom were numbered. During his incarceration, his second wife abandoned him, further compounding his sense of loss and isolation. Despite the bleak circumstances, He tried to stay out of trouble and served his sentence in the notorious Leavenworth Penitentiary. In this environment, he commanded respect from younger inmates who recognized him as a survivor of the infamous Chicago Wars, having outlived both Al Capone and many of his contemporaries. While in prison, he found himself working with mentally ill prisoners, a role that may have offered him a unique perspective on the consequences of a life steeped in crime. After serving 10 years in Leavenworth, Moran was released in 1956, but his freedom was short-lived. Almost immediately, he was rearrested for an earlier bank heist in Ansonia, Ohio, which had yielded a meagre $4,000, again comparable to chicken feed of what he was making when he was supplying bootlegged booze to the aristocrats of Chicago's Gold Coast during Prohibition. Ultimately, Moran was convicted and sentenced to serve another 10 years, marking yet another chapter in a life defined by crime and consequence. Moran was not the only one whose fortunes crumbled in the wake of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. While Capone managed to maintain his grip on Chicago's underworld for another 3 years, his reign was marked by a significant decline in popularity. The brutal execution at the SMC Carthage garage sent shockwaves through not just Chicago, but across the globe. The sheer cold-bloodedness of the act left many, including President Herbert Hoover, demanding reform in the Windy City, setting the stage for Capone's eventual downfall. The Treasury Department ultimately brought Capone to justice in a way he had never anticipated, for income tax evasion. In 1932, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. By the time of his release in 1939 for good behaviour, he was a mere shadow of his former self. Neuropathy, contracted from his good time in Chicago's brothels, was ravaging his mind. He passed away, his faculties diminished, in January 1947. Papa Johnny Torrio kept a low profile, remaining in touch with mob activities from a distance. Acting as an advisor to various New York-based syndicates, he also dabbled in real estate until his natural death on March 16, 1957. Joey Aiello, who had long coveted the leadership of the Unione Siciliane, openly threatened Capone in pursuit of his ambition. He finally achieved his dream in 1930, but his victory was short-lived. Capone, true to his word about keeping Aiello out of Chicago, orchestrated his assassination outside his West Side apartment on a calm October evening. Scalise and Anselmi, driven by their own ambition, plotted to leverage their trust with Capone to eliminate him and seize control of the mob. Their scheme, however, was discovered. Lured to a banquet meant to honour them, Al Capone instead greeted them with a brutal twist. After a lavish feast, he presented them with an award that consisted of multiple blows to the head with a baseball bat, forever immortalised in the 1987 film The Untouchables, where Robert De Niro played Al Capone and reenacted the mob boss's brutal murders of John Scalise and Albert Anselmi in this Oscar-worthy scene. Machine Gun Jack McGurn, the gunman behind the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, fell down the pecking order after Capone's imprisonment. Once favoured by Scarface, McGurn's overbearing ego became a liability amongst other mobsters. By the mid-30s, he had been nudged out of the Chicago outfit as it had then transformed into from the Southside mob, and Machine Gun Jack was reduced to working on the fringes of the criminal underworld. In a twist of fate, it seemed that Bugs Moran might have found a measure of revenge for the murder of his 7 associates in the garage. On Valentine's Day 1936, an unknown gunman executed Machine Gun Jack whilst he was bowling, leaving a Valentine's Day card in his hand. The card bore a comic inscription that read, "You've lost your job, you've lost your dough, your jewels and handsome houses, but things could be worse, you know, you haven't lost your trousers." This darkly humorous note echoed the irony of Moran's situation, suggesting that in the world of organised crime, the tides of fortune could shift dramatically and unexpectedly. As his health continued to decline in prison, Bugs Moran lost significant weight and he soon came to suspect that he had cancer. This suspicion was later confirmed by medical professionals who informed him that lung cancer had progressed to a point beyond treatment. Ironically, Moran received the sacraments of penance and extreme unction on February the 14th, 1957 from a priest, exactly 28 years after the infamous Valentine's Day Massacre. He passed away just 11 days later on February the 25th and was buried 2 days after. In the end, only a few meagre possessions remained to mark Bugs' life. 2 pairs of glasses, 2 bars of soap, 1 razor in its case, 4 packages of razor blades, and a single legal paper. These items served as a stark reminder of a once mighty figure reduced to the basics in a life that had spiraled down from power and prestige to solitude and loss. Thus marks the end of an incredibly action-packed and interesting life of George Bugs Moran. Thanks so much for watching. Please do like the video and consider subscribing if you enjoyed. I really appreciate your support. You can also become a member of my Patreon if you're able to, and for just $5 a month you'll receive my videos early, ad-free, and access to our community, plus much more. I'll leave the link in the description if you are able to pledge. I also think I'm going to stay in Chicago for the next video, so who would you like to see me cover next? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching once more, and I'll see you in the next one.